life has to be fundamentally alienating. But why? It's because what you are cannot grasp itself, right? Can your hand that reaches grasp itself? Can your eye, which sees, see itself? Even with a mirror, there's always some distortion. It's reversed. It's different. It's not the same. The eye will never see itself directly. Can a knife cut itself? No. So the best thing that you can do, right, as the being that you are, as whatever you are, trying to understand and grasp itself, the best thing that you can do is to create things. We call it art, theories, things of this nature, right? All the activities of the mind, of the human organism. The best thing you can do is create things outside of yourself that then can point back to what created it, right? So this is to say that when you have this urge to express yourself in a poem or a song or a picture, right? The creative urge. You create something that now exists outside of yourself. And by looking at this piece, by then understanding, reading the poem you wrote, listening to the song you wrote, then you understand a little bit about yourself now. Because that song, that poem points back to what created it, right? It acts as a sort of symbol of what you were, of what created it. It reveals what created it. And in some sense, this is what it could be said that this is what the entire universe is. That the universe is the same thing that we are doing as human beings to try to understand ourselves by creating abstractions, creating art, right? And this is what the greater being, the greater mind that is the universe, is what we would call God maybe, is doing too. It cannot itself understand itself. It cannot, because it's the one thing, it cannot grasp itself. It cannot, can you hug yourself? You can't hug yourself. So it has to created the universe. It created all this variety, everything that exists, only so that it could look at what it's created and understand a little bit more about itself, because everything that it created points back to itself, right? And so this is to say that the feeling of alienation, the feeling of being separate from yourself, is just an inherent part of life. It's an inherent part of the process of growing in consciousness. It's not a bad thing per se. It's just the tension that exists before a sort of breakthrough, a sort of return back to self, right? But you cannot have a return back to self unless you have this gap, this removal, this alienation from self, right? And only when you're alien, when you're moved back from the process, can you move back to it and see what you've been separated from. And when you're separated from it, then you can sort of understand from this new vantage point what you're looking at. But in some sense, like this alienation is necessary, because at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is grasp ourselves, is to understand ourselves completely, right? But what we are fundamentally is ungraspable, right? The hand will never grasp itself. So the best thing we can do is to create these objectifications, create abstractions, create art. And this will always come with some sort of feeling of alienation. Because we already are what we are. Right? We already are what we are. But we're obsessed with trying to understand it, trying to grasp ourselves. See, that's the problem. That's what attachment is in Buddhism. We want to grasp ourselves. Which is to say, we want to become conscious of what we are. It's not enough that we are already what we are. Because That's undeniable, right? You already are what you are, but that's not enough for you. You want to understand what you are, and that's a completely different thing, right? That's to say, you want to. What does it mean to understand something? You grab onto it. You say, okay, I grasp this, and now it's mine. I understand it, right? So that's what you want to do with yourself. It's not enough that you already are what you are. You want to grasp yourself. So if you're going to grasp yourself, you're trying to do the impossible, right? You're trying to be the hand that grasps itself. How can the hand grasp itself? It can't. How does it do it? It can't. So the best thing that you can do is to create things outwardly that then point back to yourself. But it'll never be a complete grasping of yourself. And every step of that process of trying to understand yourself, trying to grasp yourself, you're being more and more greedy. You want more and more understanding. You want to grasp yourself into a higher degree of perfection, right? To the absolute, to the highest ideal, highest manifestation. And the further you obsess about this desire to grasp, to understand, then you must necessarily alienate yourself. You must necessarily separate yourself from yourself, right? Because you're trying to do the impossible. You already are what you are, but you're trying to understand yourself. And that can't be done completely. But it is what this universe is trying to do. We are, of course, driven towards this for whatever reason. I'm not here to discuss necessarily why the universe, greater mind, the absolute, the infinite, God, whatever you want to call it, is driven to understand itself. I don't know why it's driven to understand itself. I just know that it does, and that we, as parts of this, as smaller bits of this greater mind, I can tell you that the reason that why we're driven towards it is because it's driven towards it. This we can be certain of, right? And we have this drive because the greater mind has this drive, and we are helping it with this, right? We are helping God in its effort to understand itself. And so we have its same drive to understand ourselves. And by understanding ourselves, by creating art, by creating theories, philosophies, to understand ourselves and our world, we form a culture. We communicate, right? We're like cells, like neurons that are communicating with each other. And then this greater thing we call culture, and the crystallizations of our perceptions of the world into abstract forms, whether we call it knowledge or art, we're like creating memories, right? They stay still in time temporarily, just like our memories. And so we're sort of helping God create consciousness of itself, understanding of itself. But to return back to alienation, this is an inherent part of the process, right? Because if you are already what you are, but you want to now understand yourself, that means you have to fundamentally separate yourself from yourself, right? Because how can you grasp what you already are? Like the hand cannot grasp itself. So the hand creates pictures of itself, creates philosophies of itself, and these things, now that the hand perceives, or maybe the eye is a better thing, right? Because the eye actually sees things. Now that the eye has sort of created things that are separate from it, it can look at these things now that are outside of itself, that it created, and now it can have a sort of idea of what it is, because these things, it created them, right? So it says something about it. Anything that creates something, the thing that it creates always says something about the creator, right? You can always draw some sort of conclusions about who the musician was that created a song, right? Based on their song, right? You always get an idea of it, of them. So this is what consciousness is motivated towards. This is what mind is motivated towards, what we're motivated towards in our drives towards understanding. And alienation is just a byproduct. Alienation is just a part of the process. It's part and parcel of the process, right? This separation from self has to be part of the process for understanding. And the ultimate thing is that at the highest points of this alienation. It builds a tension, right? A nostalgia to get back to itself. This is what politicians use. When people get that sense of nostalgia. Trump's campaign, like "Make America Great Again." It's this drive to get back to something, get some golden era. When you get old, you want to go back to the golden era of youth. So there's this drive to get back to something, and yet you're moving forward because you can only move forward. And so that's what we're at now. This alienation causes a tension to get back to self, to get back to what you already were. But because at the same time you're driven to understand yourself and you drive yourself to further and further alienation, then you further this tension, right? And so you have these two conflicting forces, this drive to get back to self, and yet this drive to understand yourself. And eventually this energy leads to so much tension, just like an orgasm, and this is what we call transcendence, and you finally break through that, and you get a momentary vision, an openness into seeing yourself. This is what psychedelics give you, right? But it's like a cheat code. It's like an easy way to get there, which is sort of its downfall as well. This opening where you just sort of see what you are, only because you see what you are briefly, but it's only because of this alienation. So you have to have this alienation first. This is the Heideggerian clearing, right? But alienation is part of that process. You have to be alienated first. And because of that alienation, then you snap back to yourself like a rubber band. And that's what I see all around us in the modern world, right? Intellect, technology, science, philosophy, all the activities of the rational mind that have brought us the world that we would call the modern world, right? They are fundamentally alienating because they are driven by this drive and instinct to understand ourselves, right? Science, philosophy are all these things, all these abstractions of living in this outward form. They are these objects that the eye or the hand creates that point back to itself, right? Because remember, it can't grasp itself. And so the modern world is so alienating because it has to be that way, because we are trying to understand what we are, ourselves, the world, right? And science, theories, philosophies are all just abstractions, products that we then use to get back to ourselves. The problem we have right now is that we take these things seriously. We think science is the truth. We think philosophy is the truth, that these things are the truth, when in fact it's rather that these things merely point. They act as signs, right? Like a sign that says, go that way. These things only point and they say, okay, that's the thing that created it. That's the truth. Not this. This is just pointing at it. But we take this as the truth, right? And so I think this is my way of making sense of the modern world currently, right? That we're at this extremely alienating stage, and of our growth towards consciousness of what we are, and that I thought it was such a bad thing at first, but I see how it's actually necessary. It's part and parcel to the operation of this growth in consciousness. And in fact, like I was saying earlier about that tension, that this tension of we're at the alienation and all the sickness and mental illness that we see in the modern world. This is that tension. It's growing tension. We are essentially, by virtue of trying to understand ourselves, we alienate ourselves, and via this alienation, we've actually lost sight of what we actually are in truth, because now we can only see the abstractions. We can only see these signposts, and we take them for truth, when it's really us that's the truth, right? But again, this tension, this alienation, is just growing and growing, and it's going to reach a point where we finally break through, and this will be a transcendence, where we can understand what we actually are as human beings, what we actually are in the greater scheme of things. So I think, in fact, even though there's so much mental illness, even though there's so much alienation in the modern world, it's so painful in so many ways, so inhuman, that in fact we're actually priming ourselves for a next wave of the highest, spiritual growth that we've had as a species in a long time, if not forever. Hi. So it's just a different way to look at alienation. I think it's inherent. It's part of the process. And all we need to do now is to continue forward. All we need to do now is to push forward, is to this drive to understand ourselves it's going to fulfill its purpose. It's going to continue to alienate us from ourselves. The more we complexify, the more we try to understand the world around us and ourselves, we'll continue to grow the alienation. We don't have to do it, because we're going to do it ourselves inevitably, because we're driven towards it for whatever reason. But what we can do is keeping this in mind and seeing that eventually we'll have this breakthrough of transcendence. This tension is merely a welling up of energy against a boundary. This boundary is this alienation, right? And we'll break through that, just like an orgasm. You can't have an orgasm, you can't have a breakthrough without something to break through that dams that energy, right? So we experience this alienation, this tension in the modern world. It's just that welling up of energy. And the boundary is all the abstractions, all the theories we've built up around what are trying to understand ourselves. And so the best thing we can do is to be those who can see around the corner, can see that this is part of the process, and see that this transcendence will happen eventually, right? And we have all these instincts and drives to get back to ourselves. In primal, you can see it in primal diets. You can see it in the nostalgia and politics to get back to some golden age. You can see it in dance and culture. There's all these revivals of things in the past, right? Even there's that trope in fashion where like, what's hot is something. It's whatever was hot 20 years ago comes back, right? But it comes back in a different form, an altered form, and it's exactly what's going to happen to us. It's just cycles. But now, because I think the best solution we can have is to dig deep back to beyond written history, beyond to hunter-gatherer history, right? To those social systems that worked then, to those things that are fundamentally closer to our being before we created a civilization that fundamentally is alienating. But we can't go back to that. That's the key thing. We can merely bring those insights by digging back into our future, right? And when we are sick of being where we're at now because of this degree of alienation, we'll break through eventually. Because of this nostalgia, this drive to get back to ourself. And we'll take those insights from our prior versions of self and bring those into the present. That's how revolutions work. And then eventually those insights, that way of constructing the world, will itself become the new stasis, the new structure, the new new dam that we fight up against. And that will lead to another cycle of alienation. All just so we can understand what we already were in the first place. This is what all mysticism is. This is what enlightenment is. Enlightenment is essentially that. It's that momentary cessation of that incessant drive to have to grasp, right? This is why such a central theme in Buddhism is attachment. Attachment is that grasping. Right? The grasping isn't attachment. You're grasping onto it, and you're saying, "This is mine. I'm not going to let go. This is who I am. This is what the world is." So you're attached. And it's all because we're trying to understand. We're driven by this consciousness. And enlightenment's just sort of a hack that a few gifted souls, or via discipline or practice and basically a manipulation of their minds, have earned it. Enlightenment is just this. It's like, hey, I already am what I am. I don't need to understand. I can just be what I am. Then you don't need to do anything. You don't need to create any art or theories or anything of this nature. You just are. It's the simplest thing. Right? But the best we come to, for the most of us and as a species, is those momentary clearings, the Heideggerian clearing, that breath of fresh air at the top of a mountain. It's these momentary insights, this momentary clarity, until we collapse back into this incessant drive to grasp, to know ourselves. Okay. Bye. Yeah. I'll elaborate on these themes, of course, in the future, but just wanted to share that for now. I'm not saying we should befriend alienation, perhaps, but or maybe we should befriend it, but I'm saying we shouldn't be too calloused or too afraid of it, and just understanding that it's part of the process, in the sense that a scab is part of the process of healing. That there's certain weird parts of the process of life, of these things that we don't understand, that just are. The best thing we can do is understand them and befriend them to some degree, but not be afraid of them, I guess. Anyways, catch you guys on the next one. Peace.